Welcome to the Children in Scotland podcast. This episode focuses on inclusion and features a discussion between Sally Cavers from Children in Scotland and Hannah Gray from Enquire, the Scottish advice service for additional support for learning.
Hi, welcome to Children in Scotland's Inclusion podcast. You're listening to Sally Cavers. I am Head of Inclusion at Children in Scotland and I am here with Hannah Gray. We are going to be talking about inclusion, our views and perspectives on inclusion related to some of the services and projects that we work on in Children in Scotland. We'll be focusing mainly on children with additional support needs and thinking about schools, services and communities. By way of an introduction, so I have been Head of Inclusion at Children in Scotland for 2 years, but a member of staff at Children in Scotland for many more. I joined Children in Scotland first of all when the Enquire service was first launched, so that was way back in 2000. I had a spell away at the National Deaf Children's Society and returned to Children in Scotland in 2006, where returning also to Enquire and was Enquire manager for a number of years. Preparing for this discussion, I was kind of thinking about the main things that I wanted to say, and I think it's for me what I draw on in terms of my experience is the voices of and experiences of children and young people and their families, but also I was particularly affected by my experience while studying deaf studies. I did a master's in deaf studies, so that's kind of where I come from. And I'm just going to hand you over to Hannah, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi, Sally. And everyone else. So my name's Hannah, and I currently work as an advice and information officer at Enquire. We're the Scottish advice service for additional support for learning. I've been at Enquire in my current role for about 4.5 years now. And before that, I worked at the Scottish Government in policy and education to do with raising attainment. And previous to that, I also worked as an employment support worker with adults with learning difficulties. And in my role in Enquire, I have quite a lot of involvement with speaking to families and young people, and also in policy. So my role is divided between a few days a week on our helpline, which is focused mainly on parents and professionals and giving them advice on additional support for learning. And I also do some policy work, so feeding back what we're hearing from families and professionals about additional support for learning every day on the helpline, and making sure that is heard by the right people so that we can impact change. And that's kind of often where I cross over work with Sally at the moment. I think, as Sally was saying, kind of where inclusion became a really strong interest and passion for me was, through my roles in policy, but also just that most of my education actually was at the hospital at the Sick Kids in Edinburgh. So I grew up around a lot of, I suppose, what we'd now called additional support for learning, being educated in different places and with different children and young people, and not having that standard mainstream experience of education, and kind of the pluses and the wonderful pluses that come from learning in different environments, and also some of the challenges. And I think that just opened my mind to inclusion, and looking back, it's kind of informed my career up until now. So Sally, obviously I work with you in some of our policy work at the moment, but I know you're involved, and I know you're involved in the oversight of it, Enquire. But what else makes up your role as Head of Inclusion at Children in Scotland?
So I, as you say, Hannah, I have sort of oversight of our services and projects that are connected to additional support for learning. So at Children in Scotland, Enquire has been managed by Children in Scotland for 20 years. But we also have a very long-standing additional support for learning mediation service, Resolve, which is managed by Sandra Mitchell and has a team of sessional mediators. I have a role in the My Rights My Say support service. So that service is to support children between the ages of 12 and 15 who want to exercise their rights under the additional support for learning legislation. And as you say, you and I work together to make sure what we are hearing about and the evidence that we have from children and young people and their families is contributing to policy and practice change. So through consultations, through participation at advisory groups, and contribution to research. So that's a really key part of my role too. I have a little bit to do with inclusion ambassadors. So we at Children in Scotland, we support a network, a national network of young people with additional support needs who are sharing their views and their experiences about receiving support at school and again contributing to change and making sure that's fed into decision makers and at policy level. So that's kind of broadly my role connected to additional support for learning and additional support needs. I'm also currently leading a Pathfinder, a childcare project in Glasgow that comes under our Challenging Inequalities work stream. It is looking at how childcare is organised and how services are connected and trying to make improvements there. We're in our final year of 4 years, and I think it's really helpful to our inclusion work because similarly it considers what barriers children and their families have to accessing services, and thinks about what we're trying to do is think about how to break down those barriers and make sure that there's much more equitable provision for all children and families compared to other areas in relation to childcare. So that's another kind of strand of my work, and because of that, I'm also leading on Children in Scotland's early years work at the moment. So thinking about how we can particularly influence and support the workforce in seeking and gathering young children's views and experiences to help shape and develop services.
So just a few things then, Sally.
Yeah, a couple of things. I've got a lovely, diverse and busy job that every day is includes many things that are hugely interesting and also diverse. So yeah, I'm very fortunate.
Yeah, it really illustrates how inclusion is in every single aspect of everything to do with children and young people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the creation of the role at Children of Scotland was really we were thinking about making sure that the profile of our services, and we've got so much learning from our projects about inclusive practice and working alongside children and young people to make the changes that are needed. So yeah, it's certainly, I find because of the breadth of our projects and services, there's loads that we can draw on in terms of evidence to support improvement and change. So yeah, I mean, I think, Hannah, I've sort of touched on some of the areas I'm responsible for, but we were, when we were preparing for this podcast, we were thinking about maybe unpicking a little bit about what inclusion is. So I wondered if I could just ask you what inclusion means to you.
Of course, it's a bit intimidating given you're the head of inclusion. I'm expecting a really impressive and eloquent answer from you, Sally. I suppose for me, when we're talking about this, inclusion's talked a lot about a lot on the helpline, even if it's not in the phrase of saying whether a parent feels their child is included, but it's a very clear ethos when it's not working, or I don't know if ethos is the right word, but it's so clear when it works and when it doesn't work. And I think for me, I was thinking about what I believe would be like what I see as a truly inclusive environment, and I suppose it comes quite strongly back to what I imagine when I grew up in most of my time in a hospital at a 12-bed ward with children and young people, families of different needs from different places across the country and the world who needed to be communicated with and supported in different ways, and in a sort of community basically that was always changing for whoever walked through that door because everyone had a right to be there. And I think that's what inclusion means for me. It's that sense of community and sense of place, not just in a physical environment, but of being somewhere where needs are met in a way that makes there's equity and that people feel involved in their community. And I think I hear that on the helpline in the sense as well, when inclusion's working, it's when a young person, a school opens their doors to any child and an ethos in a school environment that is, these are our children, and anyone who walks through this door has a right to learn here and be involved here. So I think maybe that's more of an emotive response about everyone being together and the value of everyone having a right to be in a place or a space. But I imagine you might have a great definition up your sleeve, Sally, if I was to ask you the same question about what does inclusion mean to you.
I'm not sure I've got I think you've built me up a little bit.
Sorry.
I very much agree with the emotive response and what you're suggesting about what the experience of feeling included is and means for individuals. I think for me, we certainly in this field we use different terms very regularly, and sometimes it's worthwhile just pausing and having a think about what they do actually really mean. And I think in terms of what children and young people and their families report to us about their experiences, it is often not feeling a sense of belonging and a sense of entitlement to participating in a setting, in a service, or in a community that is the most standout thing for me. So inclusion broadly, I agree, it's not, I think we attach it to a place quite often, and it's not the place for me. It's how people feel when they're in a setting or experiencing a service, and that sense of belonging and equal contribution is really critical, I think, to making sure that everybody in our society feels that they have a right to be somewhere and participate. And I'm really encouraged by our continued focus on rights, on human rights, and on children's rights, and hopefully the incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law will really further enhance our approach and our attitudes to make sure that some of the current experiences and testimonies that we hear from children and young people are really no longer accepted or acceptable.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of kind of the mainstreaming and additional support for learning act around the present, participating and achieving. Actually, we say those words all the time in policy, but actually they do have a lot of meaning when you pick them apart. As you said, that is what we're present and participating is so vital to inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's been some good positive strides made in terms of how we consider and our vision, I guess, for our services for children and young people, but with a little bit of way to go, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose with that in mind, we've got a way to go, but over your career so far, what do you think has been achieved in Scotland to make things better for children and young people with additional support needs?
I think around about the time of devolution in Scotland, there was a big movement, there was a big parental sort of lobby campaigning about some of the inadequacies of the Special Educational Needs Framework, which resulted in the Additional Support for Learning Act being passed in 2004. But I think that in legislation, I think we have really got a really solid framework. I think everything that's included in the Additional Support for Learning legislation, I think, is what I would certainly want to see included in there. There have obviously been challenges about consistency and implementation, but the introduction of the categorisation of additional support needs, so that any barrier to learning was considered an additional support need, and therefore support should be provided, I think was a really positive step. And I suppose connected to that in terms of legislation, also the pulling together of equalities, legislation and passing of the Equalities Act. I think it was certainly a positive step, and similarly, Children and Young People Act. I think, looking at considering well-being and having that at the core of how we assess how children are getting on, really. Has been certainly in the time that I've been working in this field has been very positive. I also think that the participation of children and young people, I've really seen much more embedded approach to making sure that the views, experiences, opinions of children and young people and children and young people with additional support needs are sought and responded to. I think there's a lot happening in schools, across the third sector, in health and social care, about involving children, and that's definitely been a shift that I've seen. And I really do feel that the third sector plays a very important role here. I think there's some phenomenal third sector organisations and projects that are really supporting children's services to be innovative and inclusive. So that's a real strong point in Scotland, I think. Now you, Hannah, are an earlier stage of your career to me. So what do you think? What have you seen that you think's made a difference, made a change? From your perspective, what would your answer be?
Gosh, I don't know. I think you've covered a lot of it, which maybe shows that it's kind of all moving in a positive direction. I feel in a way, maybe it feels like still the Additional Support for Learning Act is really profound and causing quite a lot of change. So, it feels slow in some ways, but I think that opening up of the definition of what additional support needs has just been so had so much impact that it really is any barrier to your learning, and that looking at their strengths and not at a diagnosis at the beginning, it being like, it being, if you need support, you have a right to support. And I think that really, it still feels like a big game changer and is still sort of seeping through everything with time. But I think that's one of the kind of biggest differences I see is just a much stronger association that, if you need support and that you don't need a diagnosis for support, which I think is really important for everyone to see and sort of brings in the ethos of inclusion. I think it's a really good act. I don't know how I could become so keen on a bit of legislation, but I quite like it. Well, I like it a lot, although I think there's challenges we'll maybe talk about later around kind of putting that into practice. I think the ethos of that law is wonderful. I think the other thing which you kind of touched on as well was about that better listening to children and young people, but not only better listening, but actually meaningful participation. So I think since the start of my career, there started to be an acknowledgement that young people's voices should be heard. But I think that's moved just from that sort of consultation culture where you might be asked for your opinion, but nothing might happen with that. We have certainly moved, well, from what I've seen within the third sector and kind of through Scottish Government work, is there's definitely a stronger view that kind of getting young people involved in meaningful decision making about the things that actually impact them. So I think it's an assumption now that you have to involve the service users, in this case, young people, in the outcome of the services that affect them and in the planning for it. But I think for us and Children in Scotland, what's really inspired me is that it's that next level of, for example, Changing Our World, our young people's advisory group at Children in Scotland. They inform are kind of leading the organisation in a sense to me, and that really great work within the third sector that's about young people's voices really being heard, but also actioned, and the things that come out of them, that kind of closing the loop. And I think that is going to, I hope, just continue and broaden, so that it's not just writing down someone's opinion somewhere, but actually using that to inform and getting young people involved right at the beginning of that work. However, I think I'd kind of already mentioned a little bit beforehand with the Additional Support for Learning Act and things that I do think, despite the moves forward, there are some real challenges I still see. I suppose I was just wondering what you kind of see the major hurdles or things that have been in the way of improvements being made within the sector.
I think first, it's important to say, firstly, that I have, I suppose, been around when things are not going very well. Because being working for Enquire for so long, being involved with some of our services that are about resolving disagreements.
Yeah, we often say in the helpline, no one phones you to tell you you've had a lovely day. Exactly. They've had a nice day. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm quite aware that sometimes I do have when things are not going very well, much more at the forefront of what is on my mind and my consideration more than the things that are going well. However, it does reveal where there are barriers, problems, hurdles that are certainly resulting in children and their families not getting the same from their education or from their experience of services that they would like to see. So communication is one area for me that always stands out. And I think being around communication breakdown quite a lot, it's quite easy to see where the patterns are and where things consistently happen that result in an investment in quite a lot of time to resolve. And I think it's communication. So, and that's I am including both communication in terms of the exchange between individuals and also language that's used. And I think what we quite often see is the impact of where decisions are made, where there is something happening in relation to planning or service allocation or placement, and the people who are going to be the most effective not being included fully in that process. So I think sometimes time is needed, the investment in time is needed to make sure that children and their parents or carers are really a full and active participant in decision making, but also that everybody's using terms that everybody's comfortable with. I think sometimes the terms that are used to talk about children, to describe things, are not the terms that people are happy with being used. And I think it is really worthwhile to invest some time in exploring those kind of basic and fundamental aspects of communication, which I guess is all about relationships. It's making sure that people feel respected and valued. But I'm also very aware that investment in time is sometimes really quite difficult for practitioners who maybe do not have a huge amount of time available. So I think that's particularly been evident in some of the sections of the recent report on the review of the implementation of additional support for learning that was published in June this year. So that's one area that's a real major barrier, hurdle, issue for me. And I think the second one that I would say is pace of change. I think you kind of realise that once you've maybe been around about this area for me for 20 years, that there are recommendations made in reports and reviews and research that there is generally might be widespread agreement about, but that don't progress at the pace or at the speed that's required in order to make the change that's been identified that's needed. And I think for children and young people, your childhood's quite short, so that I'd like to see the speeding up of the implementation of recommendations. Like I say, those recommendations that are agreed by government and by partners in order to make the change. So yeah, they're probably the main things for me. And what about you? What do you think? What's your observation in terms of the things that get in the way?
I suppose to start with, I would have to reiterate about communication and relationship breakdown, because it's so much of what we hear on the helpline, and it can just be, and it's often no one's fault. It's a time issue, and I really feel for professionals and parents in those situations. But so much of our inquiries actually focus on de-escalation, where it's really that someone's voice hasn't been heard, or they're just not clear whether their child's getting the support or what's going on. And I do find it shocking in a way still that we still have that, being told something's in the bottom, a letter in the bottom of the school bag is giving some really big news, and just kind of the fallout within a family from that, or the worry, it comes on a Friday afternoon, and by the time it's got to Monday morning, people are really worked up and worried. And actually sometimes when they just phone the school, it all makes sense again and falls into place. But yeah, I think that kind of the communication, and it's not, I don't think, for want of trying from professionals, it's time, but it saves so much time at the other end if it works, and it's some thought is put into it at the beginning, and I think that's still something that we always need more to work on to get right. The kind of other two, I suppose I would think of, it kind of ties into that, would be around and kind of around language, is about kind of universal services. Like I said before, the difference between the hospital that I went to expecting and feeling that any child who walks in that door is meant to be there, and the experiences that some people, young people, have in families in different schools, or if they're going to mental health services, where it's like your child is too complicated to be here, or your child should be in a different place, or even that feeling that they're coming from, that there's not a service for their child, and that they don't have a space and somewhere to be. And I think that's one of the hardest things to hear, when someone's saying, oh, I shouldn't have to deal with this child, or this school isn't set up to deal with it. That wording again is so important and so painful to hear, and really illustrates when things aren't working. But I think the thing is also that wording can kind of be tied up, and also we have moved forward with being able to look and recognise things like discrimination, but there's also so much of a culture and fear of mistakes tied up with that communication, where people don't want to admit when things have gone wrong, which is very understandable, but that's frustrating for parents, and also means the learning and the change can't happen. If something does feel to a parent unequal, like discrimination, if it's kind of detracted and put somewhere else and hidden, everyone gets into a defensive position. And how do we learn and move forward? So I think, yeah, that the fear of mistakes being recognised and learnt from, really, I think, gets in the way of us making the changes we want to see. But as I was saying, I do think there has been lots of progress. For you, is there kind of key things, Sally, in the next 5 years you'd like to see, to move things forward?
Yeah, I think this is really timely, because we've just had the publication of the Additional Support for Learning review, so the review of its implementation. And there's sort of standout things for me in that, and they are mainly, so it starts with, the review report starts with children and young people's contribution. They are sharing their views and experience, and there's one point in there made about understanding, and throughout the review report there's also connected and recommendations about training and awareness. But I think understanding, so a sense of peer understanding and community understanding, and I guess it's tolerance, really, of the breadth and diversity of needs that all of the individuals in our communities have. I think we need to really do some more thinking about how we can further support that. So there's already a lot in the curriculum, but I think we need to broaden that out to make sure that that's not an experience or a view that's continued to be shared. I also feel that we've got a bit of work to do about schools and placement, and how we consider the most suitable and appropriate place for children. I think the fact that some schools just don't work for some children, and quite often what will hear about is the real difficulty that that creates for the child and their family and it's back to that locating the problem with the child. And I think that quite often the whole experience of when a placement has broken down is really, really terrible for the child or young person and their family. So I think we need to be able to respond swiftly and much more positively to that situation. I think there's an awful lot of learning from the practice in special schools that we don't really share, embrace, and act on. And I also think that connected to that is specialism. So is the support that services and schools have in relation to being able to understand and to really be able to cater for the needs of a diverse range of children and young people. There's been a reduction in the numbers of specialists in psychology and allied health professionals and in other areas, and I think that again is something that's commented on as a significant part of the additional support for learning review report, and I think we need to address it. And then finally, the other key recommendation in the additional support for learning review that really sings to me is about the celebration of achievement. So really trying to do something about our focus on attainment and exam results, which are of course important and significant. But I'd really love to see some equity in terms of how we respond as a society to the range of achievements that every individual child makes and every individual child's contribution to our communities. So that's one that I'm certainly going to champion.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I don't know if you've seen it, Sally, there's a wonderful board at New Struan School. I went to visit the special school there to do with achievements, and it's just a totally different concept of, who's got an exam result. Totally different from that, but it's one of those things whenever you talk about kind of real meaningful and equity in achievement, this board that sits in the front hallway of New Struan School just exemplifies that, and its achievements are based on individual children and different sorts of achievement and how meaningful they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hannah, what about you? What next 5 years for you? What would you like to see?
I think it's maybe a bit of a nerdy policy one, but I really believe that if we start off with the right wording and policy and guidance, it does really help make the change. But the big thing I think would be that when we look at new guidance and policy coming out, that additional support for learning and inclusion is the foundation of everything that's written, rather than being a section on the side or the end of a document, just because I think that kind of reflects the whole ethos that inclusion should permeate everything that we do. I think one of the goals in Enquire is about raising additional awareness of the Additional Support for Learning Act, and I think I would love to see that that's kind of considered in any policy and guidance that affects children and young people, that because so many of our young people, as the ASL review highlighted, that so many of our young people will experience and have additional support for learning needs at some point. It's such a big cohort that it should be part of everything that we do and part of everything that we write. And I think the kind of added into that, maybe because I studied anthropology, I always think about when we're differing and othering people, but I think I would like there to be a place where us to move to a place where inclusion and ASL are not other work or about other people doing something. I think we need specialism and that should be within it, but that adults and young people with additional support needs are just another part of the tapestry of our lives and our community, and expected to be included from the beginning in every aspect of communities. And yeah, I think that's just a few wee goals. That would be what I would think.
I think that it's really interesting, your perspective there. I think about that I think sometimes a bit of a dilemma about specialism and about inclusive practice, and I think it's one that we need to talk about and think about, because we want to be able to be fully informed and skilled at providing the right kind of support. But sometimes I think there's a bit of a difficulty about additionality and how that's perceived or treated and dealt with. So I think you're raising a really interesting point there.
Yeah, and I don't think they have to be separate. I don't know if I can quite say how they are. They don't, it doesn't seem like just because you have specialism and extra understanding of things, and that you do have people who come in and give that additional support, it doesn't mean that other people don't contribute and that you're not part of the community as a whole. But I think it is a tension. It's either universal or it's separate, and we need to work on that, definitely.
Well, Hannah, it's been good talking to you and having the opportunity to explore inclusion and some of our experiences. From a Children in Scotland perspective, one of our priority areas is to champion participation and inclusion of children and young people. So that's always our starting point, to think about experiences, views, voices, and to make sure that we are amplifying and supporting participation and engagement of children and young people wherever we possibly can. So still lots for us to do, obviously, but we'll sign off now, and thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Children in Scotland podcast. To find out more about the work of Enquire, head to their website at enquire.org.uk. And to find out more about some of the other work discussed in this episode, head to our website at childreninscotland.org.uk.